in our number 10 spot, we have the West Mesa Bone Collector. This is the name used to describe an unidentified serial killer who is said to be responsible for taking the lives of 11 different women whose remains were found buried in the desert of West Mesa in 2009. It is thought that this could be one person, or it could potentially be linked to some sort of group. There have been tips throughout the years and authorities have worked hard to try and get to the bottom of these crimes, but still the killer remains at large. There have been a few different suspects throughout the years, but there hasn't been enough concrete evidence to charge anyone with the crimes just yet. What's interesting about this case is that although the remains were found in 2009, according to authorities, upon examining satellite images, it is believed that the last of the remains were placed there in 2005. In our number 9 spot today, we have Victor and Natalia Wolf. We've got a 2-for-1 on this one, a husband and wife team like Bonnie and Clyde who are on the run for their alleged involvement in a massive real estate scheme. Of course, it's not a new idea to buy real estate for cheap and then sell it for more than you purchased it for, but these guys decided to go one step further and skip that whole first part. They wouldn't even buy the properties, they just sell them. They targeted immigrants mainly, and what they would do is drop fake ownership documents for properties and then basically just sell them, even though they obviously had no legal right to do that. By doing this, the pair was living in a lap of luxury. They had fancy jewelry, luxury cars that included a $350,000 Maybach. They were living out their dream, but this was back in the early 2000s, and everything changed when the housing bubble burst. In the end, the pair was indicted by a grand jury in 2011, but by then it was too late. The couple had fled and no one has been able to locate them since. They are said to have had ties in Florida, Arkansas, Texas, and New York, but authorities think that they might just be living in Russia. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Beer Man. This is the surprisingly low-key name given to the unidentified serial killer who took the lives of at least 6 people in Mumbai, India between October 2006 and January of 2007. It's a lot of people in a very short amount of time. The reason this unidentified monster is called the Beer Man is due to one fact about each crime scene, which ended up being how they linked these crimes together in the first place. This was the presence of beer bottles that were found scattered next to each of the bodies that were found. Of course, it's been over a decade since the crimes were committed, so it's definitely upsetting that this person hasn't been caught yet. Mumbai police have investigated and interviewed hundreds of people, but still haven't quite collected the evidence they need to be certain of the suspect. In our number 7 spot today, we have Joseph McCool. So Joseph was one part of a scheming trio. He, along with 2 other men named Cameron Campbell and Donald Manning, formed a company called Brixton Group. This group was built on promising a pretty stellar deal where an investment would guarantee you a 10% return per month, and that it was risk-free because the money was actually insured by the State Bar of California. And not only this, but also this money would be lent to countries that were experiencing war in Eastern Europe so that they would be able to purchase refrigerators for citizens who were impoverished. Wow, that's quite a deal, isn't it? I don't know, something about it seems too good to be true, but maybe that's because I know what happens next. Of course, in 2006, it turns out that a grand jury indicted the 3 men because, well, I mean, there were no fridges, there was no insurance as promised, and of course, there was no monthly return, 10% or otherwise. Both Cameron and Donald pleaded guilty to their charges of fraud and conspiracy, and they served their time for their crimes. But not good old Joe. No, of course, that guy has to flee and just disappear into the wind. Some authorities believe he may be hiding in Europe, while others believe he may be in the Philippines. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Honolulu Killer. This is another one of those pesky, horrifying, unidentified serial killers who, of course, was active in and around Honolulu, Hawaii. These crimes took place in 1985 and 1986, and throughout those years, it is said that whoever is responsible for these crimes took the lives of at least 5 women. The women seemingly didn't have any connection to each other as they were from all different walks of life, but because of the gruesome similarities of each crime, authorities were able to determine that they were likely committed by the same person. Despite the years it's been, the perpetrator has never been identified and could still be out there somewhere, hiding from taking responsibility for their actions. In our number 5 spot today, we have John and Julianne Dimitrion. Back with another husband and wife team, this pair were mortgage brokers turned fraudsters. They They were last seen in July of 2010, which was just before they were set to appear in a federal court in Honolulu to face the consequences of their schemes, which they had previously pled guilty to. Basically, the pair had another company called Mortgage Alliance, and this company would target homeowners who were in trouble and facing things like foreclosure. The pair would offer to purchase their homes and help repair their credit. They claimed that they would invest the funds, but rather than doing this, they instead kept the money for themselves to fund their expensive hobbies, which included collecting things like high-end electronics, airsoft replica firearms, and designer purses, shoes, and lingerie. At least they were using their money responsibly. You can tell that they just really needed it, which I respect. The pair has, of course, been on the run for over a decade now, which means that they truly could be anywhere, and authorities have received tips of their potential whereabouts from all over the world. Currently, there is a $10,000 reward that the FBI is offering for any information that leads to their arrest. In our number 4 spot today, we have Jason Derek Brown. This piece of work has been missing ever since November of 2004. That's quite a long time, but that doesn't mean authorities are giving up looking for him. Jason fled from Phoenix, Arizona in that year after he allegedly took the life of an armored car guard who was outside of a movie theater. After committing this horrific crime, he then took the money and ran. On the FBI website, where it details his crimes as well as other things about him and who to contact with any information, gives like a little bio on Jason, and in it says that he enjoys being the center of attention and that he clearly likes showing off his luxurious lifestyle. It's crazy how many of these people who are known for like trying to flaunt their actually stolen lifestyle. It's just wild. Another thing that the website reminds us of is that he should be considered armed and extremely dangerous, so just be careful out there. In our number 3 spot today, we have the I-70. This is the name of what is believed to be an unidentified serial killer who is known to have taken the lives of 6 store clerks in the Midwest in the spring of 1992. The reason he is referred to as the I-70 killer is because most of the stores were just a few miles off of Interstate 70. While most of his victims were women, there was one man, but it is believed that he may have been expecting a female employee. The killings were clearly the main objective of his crimes, considering the fact that at each scene there was only a small amount of cash that was taken. Aside from these initial 6 crimes, it is thought that he also might be responsible for the deaths of 3 more store clerks in Texas in 1993 and 1994, as well as 1 more in Indiana in 2001. This story has been featured on episodes of Unsolved Mysteries, America's Most Wanted, and Dark Minds, but despite this, whoever is responsible has never been identified. In our number 2 spot today, we have Victor Guerrena. Back in September of 1983, Victor was 25 years old and was a trusted employee of the West Hartford, Connecticut Wells Fargo Express Company, but on September 12th, that all changed. After working throughout the day and completing the scheduled rounds of currency collection from the local banks, Victor held his co-workers hostage before tying them up, handcuffing them, and injecting them with a mysterious substance he claimed would leave them unable to move. After doing this, Victor proceeded to take about $7 million, which was one of the largest cash robberies in US history at the time. His co-workers were later able to get themselves untied and they called authorities, but by that time Victor was gone. They found his car, but it had been abandoned, and of course the money was gone. They later found out that Victor was a part of a larger group who had orchestrated this entire thing, and they also found out that part of the money was used to purchase a surface-to-air missile that was later launched at FBI headquarters in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Thankfully, it turned out to be a huge waste of money because it did little damage, and fortunately no one was injured. 2 years later, there were 14 people who were arrested in Puerto Rico, Massachusetts, and Texas as they were found to be involved in the entire operation, but Victor once again escaped capture and has not been seen since. In our number 1 spot today, we have Glenn Stewart Godwin. Man, this guy definitely has quite the history. So basically, in 1980, Glenn was working in California and didn't really have too much of a criminal record. For some reason, he and his roommate, however, decided to make a plan to rob someone that they knew who was once a friend of theirs. Of course, things go awry and it turns into a botched robbery, and Glenn ends up taking the life of the person that they were robbing. Also, this isn't necessarily important to what we were talking about today, but it's just so unhinged I couldn't leave it out. In an attempt to destroy the evidence, Glenn tried to blow up the crime scene. The explosive went off, but obviously they were still able to figure out who committed the crime. Both Glenn and his roommate were both tried and convicted for the crimes in 1983. This of course is not where the story ends, however. In 1987, Glenn tried to escape prison and failed, and this landed him at a higher security prison, Folsom State Prison, which is actually a maximum security prison. Somehow, once at this new one though, he attempted another escape and this time was successful. He fled to Mexico where he tried unsuccessfully to be a part of an illegal drug trade. He was arrested again and sentenced in Mexico, and this is when American authorities began the process of trying to get him extradited. During this process, Glenn decided that it would be a brilliant idea to take the life of an inmate who was a member of the Mexican drug cartel, which very obviously slowed the process of extradition. This gave him time to plan another escape, which he did in 1991, and since then he has been on the run.
Starting us off at number 10, Joseph Kony. In case you blocked out the fever dream that was Kony 2012, let me give you a bit of a refresher on the evil and cruel man known as Joseph Kony. Kony is a super evil who formed a Christian fundamentalist group called the Lord's Resistance Army, or LRA. The group initially aimed to overthrow the government, but didn't stop there. Soon Kony became notorious throughout all of Africa as a destructive warlord, and is documented having kidnapped 60,000 minors and forcing them into either becoming soldiers for his group or becoming slaves in other unspeakable ways. Kony claimed to be doing all of his crimes in the name of God and insisted he was not a terrorist but a freedom fighter. And of course that was definitely not the case. Since 2006, the LRA allegedly no longer operates in Uganda and is believed to be somewhere in the South Sudan, but no one knows for sure. And as for Kony, well, the monster is still out there hiding from authorities, but let's just hope that he is found soon.
So before we continue with the list, I just wanted to let all of you know that I host a channel called Most Amazing Top 10 Anime. So if you like, overly powered characters with big eyes and crazy hair yelling at each other and punching and hitting each other, then check us out. The Frankford Slasher. This next awful human being is believed to have been, taking the lives of 9 women in Philadelphia between 1985 to 1990. All that's currently known about him is that he's most likely, or was most likely, a middle-aged Caucasian, as a number of his victims were seen with someone matching that description before their deaths. What's odd about this case though is that the victims' ages range from like their late 20s to late 60s. That's quite the gap there in age. Typically, serial killers have a more specific, age range of their victims. The only thing really connecting these 9 is that they were all female. Now, if the killer was indeed a middle-aged man in 1990, there's a good chance that he may no longer be alive. But if he is, probably an elderly man now, making this case incredibly frustrating, as this is a guy who managed to commit this string of murders and live his entire life having never faced any consequences.
Coming in next, we have Josephine Sunshine Overacre. Active in the 1990s, Josephine started out as a mere environmental activist. But in 1996, along with genealogy professor William Roger, Josephine formed an offshoot of the already controversial collective called Earth Liberation Front, and she called hers The Family. The activist turned eco-terrorist group committed a string of bombings and arson between 1996 to 2001. And although no one was killed in the attacks, they managed to rack up $48 million in damages in the name of revenge for Mother Earth. And listen, can I just say that if you are fighting to treat the Earth better, maybe setting buildings on fire and blowing them up, which in turn creates a huge negative impact on the environment, might not be the best way to go. But either way, Overacre has managed to evade arrest and stay in hiding since her 2003 disappearance. She is the only member of the family that remains on the loose, and although it's not certain, authorities believe she is among an anti-government group in Spain, or at least somewhere in Europe.
So let's get away from killers for a moment and talk about Victor Figueroa. So there's a soccer player with the same name. I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about an escaped convict, the only known prisoner to have escaped New York State Prison and never get caught. In February of 1996, Victor was supposed to be on his way to the mess hall, but they found he was nowhere to be found. Prison guards searched everywhere, only to find a set of footprints leading to an abandoned mine shaft. The conditions of said mine shaft making it really dangerous to continue their search. Now, what's so strange about this, case is that Victor wasn't serving a very long sentence, only like 4 years at most. But he had a phone call with his sister a few days before he went missing, saying that one of the prison guards was giving him a really hard time. It's been speculated that he might have died falling into the abandoned mine shaft, but who knows, he could have survived and is still out there. There's also the possibility that said guard had something to do with his possible death, which I definitely hope isn't the case. Anyway, he's not as evil as other ones on this list, but this is still a very strange case.
Next up, the Freeway Phantom. The scariest thing about this convict is that no one actually knows who it is. An unidentified killer from Washington back in 1971, this monster abducted 6 young girls over the span of about a year. The Freeway Phantom was known to be a sicko and would tie up and strangle his victims before doing unspeakable things to their bodies, and then finally would dump them along the highway to be found. What was particularly odd about this killer was that he kept the victims' clothes on, or at least redressed them, except for their shoes. They never had their shoes on when they were found. That was until his second to last victim, when a fully dressed girl, shoes and all, was found with a note that read, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can. Signed, the Freeway Phantom." Over the years, they did have a few suspects, but they never managed to convict anyone for the gruesome acts, and this monster remains out there, hiding with a $150,000 price on their head.
Alright, next on the list is Glenn Stark Chambers. We got another escaped convict on the list, only this guy is lower on the list than Victor because he's much scarier. He wasn't in prison for drug charges, he was in for murder, and he was serving a, full life sentence. But after years of relatively good behavior, he was allowed and given permission to work in the prison building furniture, which I wouldn't really call much of a, reward. Hey, you've been pretty good now, kid. Why don't you get in there and go build some coffee tables? To be fair though, Glenn wasn't, a very good dude, so that would probably be my gift for him as well. Anyway, understandably, Glenn wasn't about the furniture construction life, and, decided that his good behavior deserved even greater opportunities, like just not being in prison anymore. So he escaped. In order to escape from Florida's Polk Correctional Institute, Glenn had to think outside the box, or should I say, inside the box. He had several other inmates load him up, seal him in a crate, which was then shipped off to a warehouse outside of the prison. He was never seen again, with nothing but an open crate left when the truck was getting unloaded later. Ooh, spooky.
Coming in next, we have Bradford Bishop. Once a former Foreign Services officer for the United States, Bishop's whole life took a turn when he killed his entire family. The fateful day was March 1st, 1976, and after not receiving the promotion he had been anticipating, Bishop told his secretary he wasn't feeling well and left the office early that day. On his way home, police believe he stopped at the bank and withdrew several $100s before stopping by the hardware store to buy a pitchfork, shovel, and a can of gasoline, among a few other strange items. He returned home around 8 p.m. and from there released terror on his wife first, followed by his mother, and finally his 3 sons. He then allegedly drove their bodies to a wooded swamp roughly 300 miles away and set them ablaze before disappearing forever. Over the years, there have been many alleged sightings, but authorities have yet to be able to capture him. He continues to be high on the list of FBI fugitives, but no one knows for sure just where he's hiding.
Next on the list is the Long Island Killer. This elusive serial killer has several different monikers actually. The Manorville Butcher, the Craigslist Ripper, the Gilgo Beach Killer. Basically, he's dangerous and a pretty despicable person. That's what I'm deducing from reading those names. I say guy, but we really, aren't quite sure, though a large number of serial killers are men, so I just assume that's the case. The Long Island Killer has been active for a long time, around 20 years, and throughout that time, he's believed to be, responsible for the murder of up to 16 people, mostly using Craigslist to lure his victims before disposing them by the beaches of Long Island, where the bones of his victims began to be discovered. Most of his victims are sex workers, which sadly is often the case with serial killers. It's scary to think that this individual is still out there and could be anybody.
Alright, and next up is Alexis Flores. Currently one of the top 10 most wanted fugitives in America, Alexis Flores has been in hiding for his gruesome crimes ever since 2007. Now, back in 2000, a homeless man who people believed to be named Carlos at the time killed and then committed heinous acts with the body of a girl. Once the girl was found, Carlos had already fled the scene. Cut to 2002, and Alexis Flores was visited by the police for a mere noise complaint, but upon providing them with false ID, which is a felony in Arizona, was arrested and incarcerated for 60 days until he was ultimately deported back to his home country of Honduras. Then, in 2007, after DNA samples had been taken while behind bars, they found an unsuspecting match and only then realized that Carlos and Flores were in fact the same person, and that they had unwittingly let a killer run free. A warrant for his arrest was immediately sent out, but they have yet to be able to track him down, and it's believed he remains hiding out in Honduras to this day.
And coming in at the top of the list, we have the Stoneman. Between 1985 and 1989, a mysterious string of murders occurred in India, first in Bombay and then in Calcutta. These 26 murders were soon believed to be perpetrated by the same person. The first set of murders happened in Bombay. Homeless people were found having been bludgeoned to death in their sleep with stones. Police began to see a pattern after the sixth body was discovered. The assailant was never found. In fact, it's still not even clear whether these murders were committed by just one person, a group, or if copycat killers started operating. These murders were followed by the 13 murders in Calcutta that are officially known as the Stoneman murders. These ones took place over just a couple months and could have been committed by the same person in Bombay, but it's not officially known. The circumstances of the murders were exactly the same though, all homeless, all killed with stones. Several possible suspects were detained and brought in for questioning, but there was just not, enough evidence or even any witnesses to these attacks, so anyone detained was soon released, and the perpetrator or perpetrators have never been found. What makes this case extra sad is that the victims were members, of society who were, cast aside and forgotten about, and their murders were never, high profile, making it much easier for whoever committed the crimes to go under the radar.
This list we have the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. This cult with the catchiest name was founded in Uganda by 4 ex-Roman Catholic priests, 2 ex-nuns, and 1 former sex worker, and it was initially said to really emphasize the 10 Commandments. Apparently these leaders thought that the Roman Catholic Church had really abandoned the 10 Commandments, and they wanted to bring back some rules. They couldn't just focus on these rules, however, they also had some doomsday prophecies as well, like all good cults. They claimed that the apocalypse would come on December 31st, 1999, and in anticipation of this, a bunch of the members sold all of their possessions, so of course they were pretty irritated when the world in fact did not end. The leaders scrambled and instead altered their prediction, saying that the Virgin Mary would instead come on March 17th, 2000, and that she would bring them all to heaven. The followers continued to believe this, and on March 16th they had a huge feast. The following day, on March 17th, police arrived to where the cult resided and found that an explosion and fire had killed hundreds of members of the group. At first they thought that this could have been a voluntary event, but soon they saw the signs that pointed to this being a mass killing. The leaders likely took the lives of the followers because they could not pay them back, and they also knew that their quote-unquote prophecies were false. At first it was thought that the leaders were among those whose bodies were found, but that isn't quite the case. No one is exactly sure if they ended up losing their lives or if instead they fled the country, which many people believe. At this point there is still a warrant out for their arrest, so while the authorities have never officially confirmed that they are on the run, it is truly the most likely scenario. In our number 9 spot today we have Karen ZERBY. Karen is the leader of the cult now known as the Family of Love, which is much better known by its former name, the Children of God. In 1969, Karen joined a group called Teens for Christ and ended up becoming the personal secretary to David Berg, who was the one who founded the group. Eventually, David would divorce his wife in order to marry Karen. Karen had a son named Ricky, and his childhood was made into a book which was used to show other members of the cult how they should raise their children, but the book included some pretty horrific and disturbing content. At first, Karen wasn't around or extremely active in the cult, but she began to insert herself more and more and began making rules and enforcing discipline. Once David began to get sick in 1988, Karen took over the leadership position that she had been groomed for. After David passed away, she married another leader from the cult, and all the while Karen was extremely elusive. So much so that some of her followers didn't even know what she looked like. This cult has actually seen a few celebrities over the years. Jeremy Spencer, who is one of the founding members of Fleetwood Mac, is a member of this cult. Joaquin Phoenix and his siblings were unfortunately subject to this terrible cult when they were growing up, but they all chose to leave later in life and as adults have spoken out about the cult. Unfortunately, Karen is still active as the cult's leader, even though she most definitely should be in prison, and she still remains in hiding, living off of what money she could collect from her followers. In our number 8 spot today we have Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs is the president of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints, and is also serving a life plus 20-year sentence, which is exactly where he should be, but before being caught, he lived his life in hiding from the authorities, trying to flee the persecution he had to know was coming. His father was once the president of the cult, but when he passed away, the position was passed on to Warren. As new leader of the polygamous cult, he said that no one should even attempt to marry one of his father's widows, but just a few days later he himself married all of them except for 2 because one refused and then was banned from ever marrying again, and the other ran away. If your marriage proposal causes someone to flee the cult that they're in, you clearly aren't a very good person. Warren had the power to assign who would marry who, but he was also able to punish a man by taking his wives and children and assigning them to another man. As a man, you had to have at least 3 wives in order to get into heaven, but the more wives, the more likely it would be that you got into heaven. In 2005, the Texas authorities conducted a raid and took legal custody of 416 children after someone called in and tipped them off about all of the horrible things that were happening at the ranch. In 2006, Warren was arrested and is still serving his sentence. There is so much more to this case that we don't have the time to cover, but there was a documentary released this year called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, which I would fully recommend if you want to know more about this horrible person. In our number 7 spot today we have Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo. Adolfo was at one point a dealer and also the leader of a horrifying cult that was nicknamed by the media the Narco-Satanists. Adolfo's followers believed that he had magical abilities, but in the worst way possible. He required his followers to kidnap young men who Adolfo would practice horrible, sadistic rituals on and ultimately take their lives in order to replenish his magic. It's an absolutely horrific story, and this carried on for years until the disappearance of Mark Kilroy. Mark was a Texas college student who was in Mexico for some fun over spring break in 1989, but sadly during this trip he was taken by the cult's followers. Mark's friends quickly noticed his disappearance and began searching for him. This led to a border-crossing manhunt, and authorities quickly revealed what had been going on, but Adolfo had already fled. He and 4 of his followers fled to Mexico City, and this is how he was finally caught. Police were called to the apartment they were staying at as a result of a totally unrelated dispute, but because Adolfo knew they were looking for him, he just assumed that they were there for him and he opened fire with a machine gun. Not wanting to go to prison, he then handed the weapon over to one of his followers and asked him to open fire on himself, and by the time police were able to reach the apartment, he was already dead. In the end, 14 cult members were charged for the crimes relating to everything that went on. In our number 6 spot today we have Shoko Asahara, leader of the Aum Shinrikyo cult and claiming to be the reincarnation of the Hindu god Shiva. Spoiler alert, he wasn't. He said he was destined to lead his followers to salvation once the apocalypse came, but then once he lured in followers, he claimed he could also teach them to levitate and develop telepathic abilities. Apparently those who were most skeptical, he allowed them to drink his bathwater. I have no idea why or what this was supposed to be for, and I wish I could unlearn it, to be honest, but now we all have to suffer with that information together. The cult continued to grow, and it drew in influential and wealthy people, and what did Shoko do? He devised a plan and had a group go on to attack Tokyo in 1994, which took the lives of 7 people. Then in 1995 they released gas into the Tokyo underground, which led to 12 deaths, 50 injured people, and more than 5,000 people with temporary vision problems. Of course, this sent him into hiding as he didn't want to face the consequences of his actions. After several months, however, he was found hiding out in the group's compound near Mount Fuji. In the end, Asahara and 11 of his disciples ended up being arrested and charged, and they were all sentenced to death in 2004. In our number 5 spot today we have David Koresh. You may also know him as Vernon Howell, but whatever you call him, he sucks. In the 1930s, Lois and Ben Rodin, who were the founders of the Branch Davidian sect, believed that a new messiah would arrive. Shortly after this is when David joined the group and he began to get close to the pair. After Lois passed away, he managed to gain control of the following, and he changed his name to become the new leader and self-proclaimed messiah. Under the control of David, allegations of horrible crimes began to come out from the cult, and on February 28, 1993, there was a warrant issued for his arrest, but David wasn't about to give up that easily. David hid himself inside of a compound, and when the authorities came knocking, things escalated and there was a shootout in which 6 members of the group lost their lives, but so did 4 members of the ATF. Over 51 days there were negotiations being made with David while he continued to stall. It is said that this all finally came to an end when the FBI carried out a last mission to take members of the sect by force. This is when the compound they were in was set on fire and 76 members of the Davidians, including David himself, perished. In our number 4 spot today we have Jim Jones. Jim is certainly one of the most well-known people on this list for all of the wrong reasons. He is the man who claimed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, and Gandhi, and he founded the cult which was originally called Wings of Deliverance, but he later changed the name to the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. After an expose in the New West magazine about the things going on in this cult, Jim felt the need to move him and his followers into hiding. In order to flee the media scrutiny in the United States, Jim leased land in Guyana and ended up moving them all there. From here there were claims of horrible things and human rights violations, which led to another investigation. People found out that some of the supposed members of this cult were actually being held against their will. In the end, with all of this going on, Jim managed to convince his followers to all take their lives in one massive, horrible event, and this day has gone on to become known as the Jonestown Massacre. A total of 918 people died that day, including Jim himself. In our number 3 spot today we have the True Russian Orthodox Church, also known as Heavenly Jerusalem. This cult was an offshoot of the Russian Orthodox Church founded by Peter Kuznetsov. Back in 2007, there were about 30 members of this group that all went into hiding in a Russian cave, where Peter told them that they had to wait until the world ended in 2008. This one is a little different from the others on this list because while Peter put these members into the cave, he didn't go in there with them. After 2 members died in the cave, one passed from cancer and the other from starvation, some of the members ended up deciding to leave. Like, thank goodness. They ended up leaving because they were frightened of the toxic fumes that could come from the corpses. The other members in the cave only left after the roof of the cave started to collapse in 2008. In May of that year, after the bodies of those who had passed were removed by authorities, the cave was then blown up. In our number 2 spot today we have Daniel Perez. Daniel Perez might be better known by his alias Lou Castro, but whatever you want to call him, he led a cult that was located on a 20-acre property in a rural area just north of Wichita. He convinced his followers that he had magical powers, and he told them all that he was a centuries-old angel who needed to commit some horrific crimes in order to stay alive. These crimes would have certainly been more than enough to just throw him on this list, list, but he of course couldn't just stop at committing one type of crime. He had to make sure he really stole the show on being the worst. Basically, he had this clever idea to use his followers' life insurance policies in order to live a lavish lifestyle. Like, as if no one would think that's weird or suspicious. While some of these life insurance policies were collected through regular means, of course that kind of greed only leads to evil things, which of course means that he ended up taking one of his followers' lives so that he could collect the cash. It is thought that he also contributed to the deaths of some of the other people's life insurance policies he cashed in on, but unfortunately there was never any evidence that would be able to substantiate that claim. In 2010, Castro moved from Kansas to Tennessee and adopted a new identity, but he was soon arrested by the FBI for aggravated identity theft and fraudulent use of a social security card number. While serving time for this crime, it was discovered what his real name was, as well as the charges that had been placed against that former identity. Thankfully, in February of 2015, he was convicted on all counts and received a sentence of 80 years in jail. In our number 1 spot today, we have Benito Massaro. At 25 years old, Benito decided to move his life to America, where he began to post his teachings online, but recently, former members of his cult have begun speaking out about the harm that they faced as a part of it. It is said that many of his beliefs follow the sort of ideas of igniting a quote global awakening, and that he plans to quote establish an enlightened civilization ready for interstellar absorption by 2035. But aside from these lofty goals and ideologies, the leader has come under his fair share of scrutiny, and for good reason. His first time in the hot seat was back in 2017 after somebody took their own life at one of his 12-day Sedona retreats. This story quickly picked up the attention of the media, where critics began referring to him as quote Steve Jobs meets Jim Jones. Apparently, as a result of this criticism, he ended up moving from the United States back to Holland. This is where he continued to hold retreats, but because of the intense scrutiny, he has vanished quite a bit from holding these in-person events, instead moving a lot of his content over to, you guessed it, right here on YouTube. And he is not shy in showing off the money he has been given by his followers. One of Benito's former followers, Jade Electra, has taken to her Instagram to warn others of the danger of his cult and teachings. She wrote, quote, "He is a walking dementor, and I am standing up and sharing the truth because too many are abused and stuck behind the fear, the bullying that occurs in the cults, and their literal gag orders students are given before they even know what will happen to them." Another former member who also spoke out, Keelan McNeil, wrote, quote, "Over the course of the years, it became increasingly and eventually blaringly obvious that Benito Massaro's intention is to not actually help the planet or others, but it is to use his, quote, mission or organization to get what he wants, which is only women, money, and power." She continued on, quote, "I want you all to know that the psychological and spiritual warfare that takes place behind closed doors and within Benito Massaro's community is extremely dark and dangerous. People are giving up their free will under the guise of transcending their egos, and Benito Massaro is exploiting them in every way that he can as a result."
For number 10 is Jack the Stripper, not to be confused with his earlier inspiration Jack the Ripper. So back in 1964 and 65, there occurred in London, England, the Hammersmith nude murders. Those murders encompassed the brutal killing of 6 prostitutes, all of whom were found naked inside or near the River Thames. He killed 2 women before the 6th, and it's not confirmed he was the perpetrator, but it was very likely. The first early victim was 21-year-old Elizabeth Figg, who was found strangled and naked on a north bank of the river. The second victim was 22-year-old Gwyneth Reese, the third was Hannah Tailford, then came Irene Lockwood, Helen Barthélemy, the 6th was Mary Fleming, and the last 2 were Frances Brown and Bridget O'Hara, but interestingly enough, these 2 girls weren't found anywhere near the river. A sketch of the murderer made him seem quite young at the time, and despite there being many suspects, the person was never captured, meaning someone is hiding out there who's killed 8 people and probably more. Coming in at number 9 is John Paul Sr. As an American racing driver, John won the FIA World Challenge for Endurance Drivers in 1978 and 1980, and he won the Trans Am Cat 2 in the year in between, and that's about it in terms of his achievements. Now let's go in chronological order. In 1979, custom agents discovered weed residue on his boat and then found 710 kilograms of it in a nearby truck, which got him 3 years of probation. Then in 1981, his wife, who he had separated separated from, vanished into thin air, and then he divorced her. Very odd, no investigation into it, but moving on. Then in 1983, a man called Stephen Carson was shot 5 times in Florida, and he claimed it was John who shot him. He was then arrested before fleeing right before his trial. He was caught in Switzerland and then extradited the hell back to the US, where he was imprisoned by 1986. Then he tried to escape, failed, and was eventually granted parole in 1999. But there is more. After he got out, he met an office manager called Colleen Wood. It was a whirlwind romance. She sold her house and quit her job and moved in with him on his boat so they could go on some honeymoon around the world boat trip or something. But the next December, she too had disappeared into thin air. Paul was suspected but not charged, and he too then magically disappeared. A randomer saw him in the Fiji Islands and reported him, but nothing happened. The FBI are still looking for him to question him on Colleen's disappearance, and I feel like they should add his first wife's case into it as well. Like, nobody's looking for her. They should be. At number 8, we have Bible John. Ah, you son of a gun. The Bible John is an unknown serial killer that killed 3 women in Scotland back at the end of the 60s. The man had a specific type: young, brunette, attractive. Kinda sounds like me, to be honest. Now, each woman had met him at the Barrowland Ballroom and then I guess got led away by him. The first victim was 25-year-old Patricia Docker, who was found in a garage doorway. Cause of death: strangulation. The second victim was 32-year-old mother of 3, Jemima McDonald, who actually had eyewitnesses. They saw her leaving with a brunette, tall man who had a Glaswegian accent and kept quoting the Bible, hence the name Bible John. The 2 murders gave up no suspects, and initially the police didn't even think they were murdered by the same person, despite all the shocking similarities between both crimes. The third victim was 29-year-old Helen Putek, who had been badly beaten and raped. Helen met the man with her sister Jean, and he had introduced himself as John. When the third case was brought to light, it was clear they had a serial killer on their hands, and despite having countless suspects, including serial killer Peter Tobin, there was no arrest or conviction made. Bible John never killed again, but he's still out there somewhere when he should be in jail. Filling at number 7 slot is William Morales. So this man was the chief bomb maker for the Armed Forces of National Liberation, which was a Puerto Rican paramilitary organization that wanted Puerto Rico to be independent. William had joined the FALN by 1970 and was implicated in around 50 bombings within 4 years. The worst incident occurred in January of 1975 when the Francis Tavern Museum was bombed, killing 4 people and injuring over 50. William was actually interviewed by the FBI in 76 but was let go since they thought he was just an activist and not a suspect. Oh boy, was you wrong. 2 years later, William was in the middle of making a pipe bomb, but he messed up. The timer on his bombs was set by the hour hand, but he had filed down the minute hand by accident, and so the bomb detonated in his hand 4 hours early, and he got it bad. He lost an eye, 9 fingers, his lips, his jaw was fractured, and of course, he had passed out. When he woke up, he tried destroying the evidence before the police could get there, but when they did, authorities found 200 pounds of explosives and 66 sticks of dynamite, and they took him to a hospital because, criminal as he may have been, his injuries were extensive and dire. He was convicted in 1979 and sentenced to 99 years in jail, but after being moved from prison to Bellevue General Hospital, he managed to escape out of his window. He quickly fled to Mexico, and despite being caught, he wasn't extradited and then just went to Cuba to live since being given political asylum. But till this day, he's still on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, with a reward of $100,000 being offered for him. Now at number 6 is Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Now this man is suspected to be a massive drug lord and leader of the Sinaloa cartel, because believe it or not, Narcos Mexico was based on a true story. He started off smuggling a few kilos here and there before solidifying himself as a cocaine trafficker. When El Padrino was arrested, his cartel split into 2 factions, the Tijuana cartel and the Sinaloa cartel. In 2006, the government launched a major offensive against drug trafficking, and the Tijuana cartel got screwed, which let the Sinaloa cartel swoop in and take their territories, and thus war ensued. Their cartel brings in multi-tons of cocaine and distributes them all over the US. He's been wanted by Mexico's Attorney General since 1998. People think he had plastic surgery done so he would become unrecognizable, just so he wouldn't have to leave Mexico and live in hiding. The FBI is offering $5 million for any information about him. Damn, Zeddy El Mayo. Gotta go on. Coming in at number 5 is Ani Nuvoyen. Now good old Ani over here was the biggest perpetrator of employment fraud in Estonia ever, and this is how he did it. don't get any ideas. Now he would post huge ads on behalf of Interwork Corporation about various jobs in the Middle East, Europe, and South America. People who applied had to pay a fee in advance to pay for the foreign passport, travel fees, etc. And keep in mind, unemployment was at a high of 17%, and the fee he was asking for was 2,335 kroon, despite the average salary at the time being just 1,070 kroon. He also used many designer brands as tactics by saying they were limited jobs, so people started bribing him 1,200 kroons to be bumped up in the queue for a job. Arnie told everyone that visas, info, tickets, everything would be handed over to them on March 23rd, 1999. But alas, his office had already closed back in February, so when the job seekers got there, they found all their documents that they had sent in the trash. But honestly, they should have done more research. One of Arnie's listed business addresses was a literal wasteland. Like, come on, people. Around 3,000 to 5,000 people got scammed by him, making him a hefty profit. By 1993, Arnie started going by the name Daniel Rosenberg and was advertising shady cars online and again defrauding people. Then the next year he went to Norway and started offering impoverished people jobs in Bulgaria, again manipulating 400 people. This guy made over 10 million kroons and was never caught. He went around defrauding half of Europe and wasn't caught. Come on now. And number 4 is Christopher Dale Flannery, aka Mr. Rent-A-Kill. This Australian contract killer had it rough from the start. By 17 years old, he'd been convicted of carrying firearms, police assault, housebreaking, and more. When he was finally released from jail, he became a bouncer, but seeing how that was boring, he moved on to contract killing, as everybody does. His first kill was a barrister called Roger Wilson, but since they didn't find the body, he was acquitted. He was then almost immediately arrested for killing Raymond Loxley, a brothel owner, 2 years prior. And again, he was acquitted. After that, he tried to improve his life and, just be on the right track by moving to Sydney and working as a bodyguard for crime figure George Freeman. Caught in the gang wars, he got paranoid and would always carry a gun with him wherever he went. In 1984, he was suspected of attempting to kill a drug squad detective, and things got messy when shots rained down on Christopher's house. Everyone survived and business continued. The next year, he was sent to kill Tony Spaghetti Eustace, and he managed to shoot him 6 times, but not enough to actually kill him. Police tried to speak to him, but he told them to F off, and then he died. Later that year, his boss Freeman called him for a meeting, and as he left, he caught a cab and went on his way. But he disappeared, leaving 2 children behind, never to return. So either Freeman killed him or he split because he was scared he would be killed. Either way, he's a fugitive on the run. Filling our number 3 slot is Hayat Boumediene. Now Hayat had her fair share of a bad life. Her mum died when she was 8, her dad wasn't there, and she was tossed between families and foster care and was beaten numerous times. In July of 2009, she married Ahmadi Coulibaly, and both were Muslim and extremely religious to an extremist level. In 2010, police found a bunch of assault rifle ammunition in their apartment, which is, not the best. Now Hayat was sought after by authorities because her husband was the prime suspect for the 2015 Montrouge shooting that was one of the Ile-de-France attacks. The shooting involved 3 attackers that killed 17 people before the police eventually shot all 3, and Ahmadi was one of them. But before any of this even happened, he had already helped Hayat flee the country. She traveled to Spain at the end of 2014 and then made it to Istanbul, where Turkish intelligence found it to be sus. They surveilled her for the next 2 days, after which she went to the Syrian border. At this time, her husband had just used her car in another attack, and she was complicit in it. She's still currently wanted for helping Ahmadi carry out his attacks and has been dubbed France's most wanted woman. Now at number 2 is Lord Lucan, aka Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan. I know, right? I love when noble people are on here, it's just that much juicier. So after World War II, Lucan was studying at Eton College, which is a very posh all-boys college in the UK for like the 1%. Now sadly, he took a liking to gambling and went on to become a professional gambler. The man was so hot, he was even considered to play James Bond. Like, hello. He was hot. By 1963, he married Veronica Duncan, and the couple had 3 children together, but after 9 years together, the marriage was going up in flames. Lucan moved out of the family home, and a huge custody battle occurred over the kids, which he lost. After taking so many hits in his personal life, Lucan became depressed, paranoid, and erratic. All his gambling losses didn't help the situation either. To try and get custody, he started spying on Veronica to prove she was unfit to raise the kids, since she had postnatal depression and had just fired their long-term nanny. nanny. After many nannies came Sandra Rivet in 1974. On the 7th of November, after putting the kids to bed, she went to the basement to make tea for Veronica, and once there, someone bludgeoned her to death with a lead pipe as the murderer told her to shut up. Apparently, Veronica heard her husband's voice and went down there, wherein they started fighting as well. Eventually, he admitted he had just killed Sandra, and Veronica agreed to help him escape. But the smart girl made a run for it and got away, after which Lord Lucan just disappeared. He called his mother and went to a friend's house, and then literally into thin air, he was gone. He literally evaporated. I don't get how someone so prolific like him could have successfully hidden for that long. He was declared legally dead in 2016 at age 81, but you can't just assume someone's dead because they're 80 years old. Come on now. People live long lives. And finally, at number 1 is Assata Shakur. Now, this woman has racked up quite a few charges in her long life. As a former member of the Black Liberation Army and Black Panther Party, political and racial activism were her whole life. And the BLA engaged in many armed shootouts against the government, since they would rob banks and kill police officers. At the start of the 70s, there was a multi-state manhunt for her after she had robbed a bank in Queens, then in the Bronx, and even a church, which was called Our Lady of the Presentation Church. The manhunt started after the FBI believed she was the head of a BLA cell that had killed a bunch of police officers. During the New Jersey Turnpike shootout, Assata killed Trooper Werner Forrester by shooting him in the head twice with his own gun, but both sides had been wounded. Between 1973 and 77, she had been indicted 10 times for kidnapping a heroin dealer, 2 bank robberies, 2 attempted murders of officers, and the rest of the charges were due to Turnpike. Many trials and mistrials occurred, of which she was only convicted once, acquitted thrice, and dismissed thrice. She was kept at Rikers Island in solitary confinement, but fellow BLA member Angela Davis claimed she was a political prisoner, so they started planning her escape. 3 members of the army got to the prison with dynamite and 2 guns, taking 2 officers hostage before escaping in a van. Wanted posters were put up for her, but in retaliation, her supporters put up Assata Shakur is welcome here posters in response. In 1984, she was given political asylum in Cuba, but the FBI is still offering $2 million for her. Fun fact, she's actually Tupac's godmother and step-aunt. Pretty cool.